Hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of MRTC Talks. My name is Paul. I'm one of the counselors here. Today's topic, friends with benefits. I'd like to tell you a true story about a town. This story begins in the summer of 1961 and with a physician by the name of Dr. Stephen Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe was the chairman of the Department of Medicine at the University of Oklahoma Medical School, but he spent his summers vacationing in eastern Pennsylvania at a farm that he had bought for himself as kind of a summer retreat. Well, back in 1961, when Dr. Wolfe was vacationing at his farm in Pennsylvania, he happened to have lunch with a local doctor there who made a very curious comment to Dr. Wolfe. The local physician said that he had been a doctor in the area for almost 20 years, and that during that entire time he had never seen a single case of heart disease from residents of a particular town in his area. The doctor said that he had seen plenty of cases of heart disease from residents of other communities in the area, but not one from that particular town. The name of that town was called Roseto. Roseto was a town of approximately 1,600 inhabitants. It had been settled in the late 1800s when immigrants from Italy came to populate it. They came from a small village in Italy called Roseto Valfertore, where they worked in the slate quarries around the village. And when they came to eastern Pennsylvania seeking work which they knew how to do, they settled near the slate mines and quarries of eastern Pennsylvania and began to build their new town. And in honor of their little village back in Italy, they named their new town in Pennsylvania Roseto. But in listening to the doctor's claims of an absence of heart attacks in Roseto, Dr. Wolfe was skeptical. This was the 1960s, after all, years before the release of anti-cholesterol lowering medications and aggressive campaigns to fight heart disease. Heart attacks, in fact, were a virtual epidemic in the United States. In fact, they were the single leading cause of death for men over the age of 65. Dr. Wolfe thought it was impossible for a doctor to have been a physician in an area for almost 20 years and never to have seen a single case of heart attacks from residents of a particular town. But Dr. Wolfe was kind of a curious guy, and if somebody told him there were no heart attacks in a particular town, he wanted to see if that were the case. So for the remainder of his vacation, he began reviewing death certificates from residents of Roseto, going back as many years as he could. Dr. Wolfe was surprised by what he found. Just as the local physician had predicted, Dr. Wolfe was unable to find the record of any person over the age of 65 who had ever died from a heart attack in Roseto, no matter how many years back in time you looked. In fact, the death rates for people under the age of 65 for heart attacks was something like half the United States national average. In fact, the death rate from almost all causes in Roseto was something like half of what he would have expected it normally to be. At the end of his summer vacation, Dr. Wolfe returned back to Oklahoma and told his colleagues at the University of Oklahoma Medical School what he had found. And together they decided over the next few years to do a full-blown study of Roseto to try to see if they could understand why there was an absence of heart attacks in this particular town. So over the next 4 years, Dr. Wolfe and his colleagues conducted a full-blown examination of Roseto, meeting with nearly 3/4 of the town inhabitants, conducting detailed medical examinations, physical histories, family histories, all types of testing, all to determine why there apparently was no incidence of heart disease in this particular town. At the end of that process, they were even more stunned by what they had found. In addition to having almost no incidence of heart attacks, there was almost no incidence of any other type of disease or illness in this town. No incidence of cancer, no incidence of diabetes, no incidence of ulcers, of alcoholism, of drug addiction, of depression, of anxiety, nothing. People in this little town of Roseto were simply dying for natural causes. That's it. As you might imagine, the doctors were stunned by what they had found and sought to find an explanation that would account for these findings. The first thought that they might have had was that perhaps the issue was diet, that somehow these immigrants that had come from Italy and settled in Roseto had hung on to some dietary practices from the old world that had somehow made them more immune to heart attacks. But as they began to analyze that question, they realized that that wasn't the answer. Rosetans, people who lived in Roseto, cooked their food with lard as compared to the more heart-healthy olive oil which they'd used back in Italy. In fact, their pizza and pasta dishes were loaded up with ham and cheese and salami and eggs. In fact, when registered dietitians from Dr. Wolf's team analyzed the dietary habits of Rosettans, they found that a whopping 41% of their total caloric intake came from saturated fats. Well, then Dr. Wolf said, well, if the answer is not diet, maybe it is genetics. Maybe it's just that these people that have come, right, from this small village in Italy are somehow more immune to heart attacks than people in the general population. So to analyze that question, they traced other people that immigrated from Roseto Val Fattore and settled in other parts of the United States and analyzed their rates of heart attacks. The rate of heart attacks of those people, 3 times that of what it was for the residents of Roseto. Well, then Dr. Wolf said, if the answer is not diet, if it's not genetics, maybe there's just something in the water, man, around eastern Pennsylvania that makes it a more healthy place to live. So to analyze that question, they looked at the heart attack rates of residents of towns all around Roseto, all that were approximately the same size as Roseto and served by the same doctors and hospitals. They found that the heart attack rates of people from those towns, once again, nearly 3 times that of the people who lived in Roseto. But slowly over time, as Dr. Wolf and his team began to analyze the issue of Roseto, they began to see that the secret of Roseto wasn't diet, it wasn't exercise, it wasn't genetics, it wasn't the location of the town, but it was the nature of the town itself. They began to see it in a number of things. They saw it in how the kitchens of Rosetan homes were filled with neighbors who dropped by unannounced in the evening and stayed late into the night, eating and laughing and talking. They saw it in how Rosetans stopped to talk with each other in the street, how they cooked for each other in their backyards, how they shared half the fruits and vegetables they grew in their garden with their friends and their neighbors. They saw it in how Roseto had 22 different social clubs, 1 social club for every 70 residents, and how more than 90% of the residents in Roseto were members or one or more of those clubs. They saw it in how the town was physically constructed, how all the homes were built close to each other and close to the street, how they all had front porches where people would sit in the evenings and talk to their neighbors on either side of them and talk to people walking in front of them on the street. They saw it in how every evening, particularly in the summer, after dinner, the ancient Italian custom of la passeggiata, or the promenade, would take place. And people would come spilling out of their homes onto the sidewalk and walk up and down the street, stopping to talk to their neighbors, to share a laugh, the gossip of the day, or to talk about how they were doing. He saw it in how the act of people breaking bread together remained an important community tradition in Roseto, how every Sunday evening chairs were added to dining tables and leaves added to dining tables to accommodate friends and neighbors for a traditional Sunday evening dinner of spaghetti and meatballs. And he saw it in how one of Roseto's strongest community traditions was that if a person was in trouble, the entire neighborhood, indeed the entire community, would rally around them to help to support them. And slowly over time, what Dr. Wolf and his colleagues came to realize is that they had stumbled upon a kind of a magical place, a place where the sense of friendship was so deeply practiced and the sense of community so strong that it had essentially inoculated people against the diseases of modern life. Dr. Wolf and his colleagues saw that the secret of Roseto was not something that could be seen through a microscope, but was something that was still profoundly true. And that is that we are nourished by other people, and that a sense of social connection and community could by itself transform the pattern of illness and mortality in American life. That is the true story of the town of Roseto, Pennsylvania, a town that was found, much to the shock of medical researchers, to have an absence of almost any type of illness or disease, and that the reason for that was because there was such a sense of connection and community and friendship in that town that had essentially prevented people, served as a buffer to prevent them from getting sick. Interestingly, over the last 50 years, a whole host of scientific research has proven what Dr. Wolfe and his colleagues stumbled upon by accident in Rosetto, and that is the single most important factor that determines a person's health, their well-being, and their longevity in life is not diet, not exercise, not obesity, not any other physical factor, but rather the depth and breadth of their social connections. One of the most powerful and large studies that proved that was a study that involved nearly 350,000 people. Just to give you a context, the average psychological experiment involves fewer than 100 subjects. This particular study involved looking at 350,000 people across 4 continents, tracked for a period of 7.5 years, a massive study to try to determine what were the factors that led to health, longevity, vitality, well-being during the course of the lifetime. What did the researchers find? They found that the single factor, as Dr. Wolfe had found, that most correlated with all of those outcomes was the depth and breadth of one's social connections. Interestingly, people that had strong social connections, strong, healthy, vibrant friendships, were 50% less likely to die during the course of the study period than people that had weaker social ties. And almost amazingly, that result held up despite a person's health status, despite whether they drank alcohol, despite whether they smoked cigarettes, despite whether they never worked out, despite whether they were morbidly obese, despite how old they were. None of those factors played as significant a role as the factor found in Rosetto, the depth and breadth of one's social connections. Even perhaps more remarkably, what researchers found is that having weak social connections, weak friendships, created as much a risk of death as a host of factors that we typically associate with a risk of mortality. For example, having weak friendships created as much a risk of dying as being an alcoholic, smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, never working out, and being morbidly obese. But where do you ever hear that? Where do you ever hear that the single factor that most correlates with health and well-being in life are not those physical factors, but rather the depth and breadth of your social relationships? When was the last time that you were ever at your doctor's office about any type of physical illness or ailment, and the guy asked you, tell me a little bit about how your marriage is going? How many friends do you have that you could reach out to in a time of need? How connected do you feel to your sense of community? I'm guessing if you're like me, the answer is almost never. Most of us continue to believe mistakenly that the answer to health and well-being resides in the body and in the physical steps that we take. While those are no doubt important, what research shows is that a factor that's even more important is the extent to which we have in our life friendship and love. But I think if you think about it, I don't think you need a story of Rosetto, or you don't need a Harvard study of 350,000 people to prove to you the incredible healing power of social connection. I think all you need to do is to reflect upon your time at Maple Ridge Treatment Center. Let me ask you a couple of questions that might help you to reflect on that. First of all, ask yourself this question. To what extent during the time that you've been at MRTC have you been able to maintain your sobriety for the most part? Maybe you might have had a slip on occasion or two, but for the most part, you have been able to maintain your sobriety. My guess is that you will raise your hand and say, yes, that's true. Now, you might dismiss that as an insignificant thing, saying, hey man, anybody can stay, this is a drug treatment center. Anyone can stay sober here, that's no big deal. This is a bubble, this is not realistic, this is not real life. So the fact that I've been able to maintain my sobriety here means nothing. It doesn't indicate anything. But I would encourage you to think about that. While that's certainly true that MRTC is not completely the real world, it is more real than you might have imagined. Consider the following. Compared to most treatment centers that you might have had experience with, MRTC has the fewest restrictions of any drug treatment center, certainly that I've ever heard of. In my first job after being a lawyer when I became a counselor, the drug treatment center that I worked at in Chicago, you couldn't leave, which was very similar, by the way, to MRTC, a residential drug and alcohol treatment center for men. You couldn't even leave the facility for the first 60 days. And even after that, you could only leave for the next 30 if you were in the company of a peer, a senior peer, or a staff member. Here at MRTC, on your very first day, if you produce a negative urine drug screen, have at it, man. You can walk around the community as much as you want. You'll also reflect that when you come back to MRTC, there's no searches. We used to search people's pockets, sometimes even ask them to lower their pants so we could try to ensure they weren't bringing drugs in the facility. There's nothing that happens like that here. There's no searches of bags or people's belongings. So MRTC has the fewest restrictions of almost any drug treatment center you could imagine. The second thing you might think of is, think about this. You probably couldn't design a treatment center that would be more in proximity to drugs and alcohol than MRTC if you tried. For a long time, as some of you know, there was a tent city located directly across the street, less than 100 meters away. In addition, right up at the Salvation Army, as many of you know, people are getting high on a regular basis. In addition, there are 3 bars within a few hundred meters of Maple Ridge Treatment Center. As I say, you couldn't design a treatment center that was more in proximity to drugs and alcohol if you tried. And yet, people stay sober here. If they stay sober here, what I would submit to you is that it's not because they can't use drugs. It's because they won't use drugs. And the question to reflect on is, why won't they? What is going on here that is enabling people to not want to use to the point where they are able to maintain their sobriety, even though there are very few restrictions at MRTC? And if you started using, we likely might not know about it. And also that you are in close proximity to using it if you wanted to. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but I'd like to ask you an even more provocative question, and that's this. To reflect on the issue of, to the extent that you've been here at MRTC, to what extent have you been happy here? To what extent have you felt reasonably happy and content while being at MRTC? My guess is, if you answer that question, for most of you, you will say that you have been. Some people might even say it's one of the happiest times they might remember. Just reflect for a moment on the remarkableness of that fact. Happy in a drug treatment center. An experience that by all rights should turn out to be one of your worst, turns out to be, paradoxically, one of your best. And so what I would submit to you is this. To the extent that you've been able to maintain your sobriety here at MRTC, and to the extent that you have felt reasonably happy and content here, first of all, aren't those your 2 goals in life? Isn't that what exactly you want out of your life, to be sober and to be happy? If those are among your main goals in life, then what I would submit to you is that you've already figured out the answer. You've already achieved here what it is that you want to achieve on the outside. All you have to do is to figure out what is causing you to be able to stay sober and to be happy, and then replicate that on the outside. And I think if you do that, if you reflect on that question, you will come to the exact same conclusion that Dr. Wolf came to in Rosetto, and that researchers in the last 50 years have demonstrated now beyond a reasonable doubt, that the single factor that is most correlated with your sense of sobriety here and your sense of well-being is the tremendous sense of friendship and connection and community that exists here at Maple Ridge Treatment Center. Am I right? Yes, I am. There is here at our treatment center, as you know, an incredible sense of brotherhood, an incredible sense of camaraderie, an incredible sense of friendship. And at the end of the day, if you really reflect on what has made the most difference to you in terms of your sobriety and your happiness, I think you will determine it is that factor. Just like in Rosetto, just like in the Harvard studies, what your own experience at MRTC has shown you is that the single factor that most correlates with your health, meaning your sobriety in this case, and your well-being, meaning your happiness, is the tremendous sense of friendship and connection that exists here. To put it in a phrase, community equals immunity. Let me say that again. Community equals immunity. And so if that makes sense to you, then I would submit to you that your time here at MRTC will offer you a blueprint or a model of what you might need to do on the outside to be able to get the same result that you've gotten here. In other words, if you can recreate the same sense of community and connection and friendship that you found here at Maple Ridge Treatment Center on the outside, then you are likely to get the same result out there that you've gotten in here, which is, by your own admission, sobriety and happiness. You have in essence created your own Rosetto here at Maple Ridge Treatment Center. And that is one of the reasons why you are sober, you are happy, and if you're really honest with yourself, part of you might not even want to leave. So what I encourage you now to reflect on is this fundamental truth that has been demonstrated time and time again, and yet which almost no one in life knows. That the secret to health, the secret to well-being, the secret to longevity is not so much diet, exercise, or healthy habits like not drinking or giving up smoking, but it is to have deep, rich, textured, nuanced friendships, connections, community, brotherhood, fraternity. That if you have that, that will inoculate you against addiction, and it will make you feel fulfilled in your life. The $64,000 question is, how do you recreate that on the outside world? In other words, how do you take the experience of connection that you have found and community that you found here at MRTC and build it into the outside? Will it look exactly the same after you leave MRTC? No. Will it be replicated to a perfect extent? Maybe not. Will there be things that you need to do on the outside that you may not be doing here? Yes, there might be. But I think if you feel like you have, as I hope you will, found the answer or unanswer that might give you the best chance at recovery, I cannot think of something more significant that you could possibly think of. If community equals immunity, how will you recreate the sense of community that you found here on the outside? What specific actions must you take? What do you need to do to be able to make MRTC portable, to take it with you? So it's not just a happy 49 days in your life, but that it offers you a blueprint and a model for what exactly you need to do on the outside. Again, I'll repeat it in conclusion. If you do out there what you've done in here, you'll get out there what you've gotten in here, sobriety and happiness. I invite you in your groups, in your individual sessions with your counselors, or in the quiet of your own mind to reflect on that. If what I've said today makes some sense to you, how can you recreate the sense of community and friendship that you found here on the outside? That may be the ticket and perhaps one of the most important things you can do to get you to where you want to go. You've already figured out the answer. All you have to do now is to figure out how it applies out there. Hope this has been helpful to you. See you next time.